David Cochrane does something pretty savage. I was actually really surprised that he did this.
I want to play a clip in this monitor if I can, Minister.
We just learned that Stephen Guilbeault has resigned from the federal cabinet, so good news all around, Mr. Speaker.
Mark Carney's pipeline agreement has turned into a political mess, and the Liberals are scrambling. BC MPs are under fire, rumors are swirling about more Liberals preparing to quit, Alberta is celebrating Guilbeault's exit, and Ottawa keeps contradicting itself hour by hour. Now Carney's Liberals are trying to contain the fallout. Let's take a look.
Well, the federal government's deal with Alberta drove Stephen Guilbeault to resign from cabinet yesterday, and sources tell CBC News that some BC Liberal MPs have also expressed concerns over this MOU. British Columbia New Democrat MP Gord Johns called out those BC MPs today.
Did you see a BC Liberal here today? No, I didn't either. And so, I think it sends a message, hopefully, to Mark Carney that his love-in with the Alberta UCP isn't going to go well in British Columbia. And not a single BC Liberal was in the House of Commons today. So I think that sends a message. And maybe they shouldn't be hiding. They should be showing up and standing here in front of you and answering questions.
So this is where things get interesting, folks, because apparently there wasn't a single MP from the Liberal Party whose riding was in BC in the House. That's interesting. It's interesting because there's 20 of them, right? 20 MPs from BC that don't seem to be happy with Mark Carney. Now, at least one of them is a cabinet minister. That's Gregor Robertson. Gregor Robertson is a relatively new cabinet minister, new MP, was former mayor of Vancouver, and remember there was a whole bunch of controversy around him and his real estate holdings and all of that. But, he's going to solve the housing crisis, right? But this is interesting because our previous video talked about sources in Parliament and sources that iPolitics was talking to where there may be more resignations, potentially resigning from the party, maybe moving out of Caucus, who knows. But even if it's resigning from cabinet, one of those could be Gregor Robertson because of what is going on. So what are we going to see here? I don't know, folks, but this is bad news. It's really bad news for the Liberal caucus because it's unlikely for this to happen. But just for fun, let's play the numbers. Let's say the BC Liberals all either leave caucus or they resign. So that's 20 Liberals. That brings the Liberal government down to 150. At that point, the Conservatives just need 7 more seats. And something crazy starts to happen. The Conservatives actually are the ones that get to set the agenda. And it would be crazy to have an opposition party with more seats than the actual government itself. So this is where things can get pretty crazy numerically. Now, do I think that 20 Liberals are going to be leaving? No, I don't think 20 Liberals are going to be leaving. But when you have 20 Liberals that are not happy and that didn't even show up to the House of Commons the other day, being called out by the NDP, what does this say? This says that they're really concerned about their jobs and they're not too happy with the direction of this. So what could be the longer term political fallout of this? Well, the longer term political fallout is this is opportunity NDP. Now, this is where the NDP could really try and do some work at the local level of BC and try and steal some seats off of the Liberals. And if they manage to steal some seats off the Liberals, they end up potentially getting party status back. And in the next election, the Liberals may fall to a Conservative win because of it. So this is where things get to be very, very interesting. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Now, one of the BC Liberals, Talib Noormohamed, ended up coming on CBC to chat with David Cochrane about what happened.
I wonder what you make of that criticism from your New Democrat colleague, Gord John, suggesting that there's a little bit of fear amongst the backbench right now.
Well, I have a lot of respect for Gord. I consider him a friend. And if Gord had done his homework, he would know that the majority of BC Caucus was actually at a summit on extortion with law enforcement, with local mayors, with chiefs of police, with the RCMP, which is a huge issue, as you know, in British Columbia. And we're working hard as a team to ensure that all levels of government, all levels of policing are there. And so if Gord had done his homework, he'd know that all of us were there having those difficult conversations with victims of extortion, as well as with the police of jurisdiction and, of course, with mayors and provincial officials, including the Premier.
Right.
You needed every single BC MP to be there? Really? Something doesn't smell like. Something doesn't smell right, Talib. Just saying. None of you showed up for work in Ottawa? You all had to go to this meeting? All of you? Even the backbenchers who can't really do anything? Cabinet members? Sure. Parliamentary secretaries? Sure. Backbenchers? All of you didn't need to be there. It's a little bizarre, don't you think? That the day after the Prime Minister announces this big initiative, if you guys were so supportive of it, why weren't you in Ottawa?
Okay, so the Premier was at that summit. The Premier's also going to be meeting with the Natural Resources Minister, Tim Hodgson, either now or within the hour, as I understand it. There's some mending of relationship that needs to happen. What does Minister Hodgson need to say to the BC government today?
I think, look, Minister Hodgson has a difficult file and is doing the work that is required. He's here in British Columbia to meet with the province. We have major projects that are being advanced, right? The majority of the major projects that are being advanced by the Major Projects Office are here in British Columbia. Two big ones, as we know, Red Chris, the big mine, as well as North Coast Transmission. These are going to be transformative for the economy in British Columbia. And, the Premier spoke about those in his availability. And the Minister and the Premier, I suspect, will talk about how do we make sure that those projects remain on track, that the work that British Columbians need for all of us to be doing to advance those projects is done in an intentional and thoughtful way. And those two projects, look, any project that comes through MPO, those are two major examples of ensuring that the jurisdiction in question, as well as First Nations, are actively engaged and have given their consent for these things to move forward.
What does the minister and the other leadership in the government need to do to keep the BC caucus on track? I talked to a lot of your colleagues this week who are concerned about the lack of communication, the lack of detail, and then some of the detail that was in this particular agreement. Where do you think the 20 Liberal MPs from British Columbia are at the end of this week?
Well, I think where Liberal MPs are at the end of this week in British Columbia is we're united behind a Prime Minister, and we're united behind a government that believes that you can build a strong economy, that you can diversify our economy and our trading partners while also respecting climate change, while also doing the hard work to ensure that we are protecting our natural environment, working in partnership with Indigenous leaders and Indigenous communities and with provinces. And that is what you are going to see from our caucus. We are united. We may have different points of view in respect of some of the specific substantive questions in the MOU, and that's for all of us to work together on. But we are fundamentally united in what we are trying to achieve, which is a strong economy in the face of some very, very difficult economic times. And with the battle that we're having with the United States on tariffs has only emphasized the need for us to be able to be not just pragmatic, but thoughtful for the long term in terms of the kind of economy we build at home and how we trade abroad.
Right. But are you comfortable, are your BC caucus colleagues comfortable with the idea of a bitumen pipeline through the Great Bear Rainforest to the north coast of British Columbia, and with the changes to things like the tanker ban? Because these have been issues you ran on in the past as a party and as a government that are now potentially on the table for removal.
Well, David, I think what Liberal members of Parliament from British Columbia and across the country are comfortable with is a process that requires the participation of Indigenous communities, that ensures that jurisdictions implicated are part of that process and conversation, that we are working together to ensure that the criteria that have been set by the Prime Minister are met. And I think, when we are talking about a theoretical pipeline, as the Premier herself noted, that doesn't have a route, that doesn't currently have a proponent, that doesn't currently have the support, or has not yet gone through the process of getting the support of jurisdictions in question as well as First Nations. I mean, this is a theoretical conversation right now. And our job should be to focus on the practical. The practical is making sure that the process to do those things is done correctly, to have conversations about major projects in a way that we have articulated. Anything that goes through the Major Projects Office to be referred has to have the consent of the jurisdictions in question, has to have the consent of First Nations. And right now, these are all, we have an MOU that is an outline, a roadmap to have a further conversation.
Right. Look, I get that the pipeline at this point has no proponent, so it's technically theoretical, but the opposition to it is not. It's long-standing and it's entrenched. And knowing that, I just wonder how you feel that the government is proceeding with this, because I'm sure you're hearing from your constituents, as I hear other members of your caucus are, that they do not like this idea, and this is going to be unpopular with voters next time.
Well, I think, we are all hearing from our constituents, as we do on these very difficult, complex issues. And, look, I can tell you for certain that constituents in my riding have expressed their views very, very strongly. And our job is to make sure those views are reflected. And what my constituents consistently say is that for these types of things to happen, you have to have the consent of First Nations. Coastal First Nations are a critical component of how we make consideration in this province. I mean, Section 35 rights are a big part of how we do things in this country, and British Columbia is going to be at the table because they're a partner. But this is, again, all theoretical right now. And the practical reality for anything coming to the table or anything coming to the fore requires that these conditions and these expectations, these requirements are actually met.
Okay, so he said a lot there, and I want to unpack it a little bit. So number one, when he started talking about, well, some of us have different points of view. So that's political speak for the BC caucus is really not happy. Whether they genuinely oppose or don't oppose this pipeline, that's separate. But their constituents, like the people that put them there, the people that voted them in, they're not happy, right? And he goes on to say that, my constituents are, they just want to make sure that there's consultation, all this stuff. And this is going to be the problem with Mark Carney. A lot of people have said, Mark Carney played this perfectly. I think he thought he was playing this perfectly. But what we said in the latest video is that he's now kind of fenced in here. I don't think he was fully prepared for this. And again, this is the whole CEO thing coming back into play. This is Mark Carney not liking to be challenged. This is Mark Carney making his decisions with his 4 or 5 senior leadership team. And that's all there is to it. I don't want any questions. This is the way it is. And my guess is this what's been going on out in BC with these 20 Liberal members of Parliament there? And I think they're getting kind of worried that their constituents are saying, what the heck? What's going on here? And now that the NDP is standing up, like they should if they wanted to use this as a political opportunity and say, this is garbage. We weren't consulted. BC wasn't consulted. First Nations weren't consulted, because First Nations weren't consulted on this MOU. And sounds like the BC Premier wasn't consulted on this MOU as well. So Tlaib is trying to kind of skirt the line here and say, well, we're not too worried about this MOU. It's theoretical. Nothing's happening. And this is just, a commitment to have further conversations. Well, not really, Tlaib. The MOU says, if this stuff, then this stuff. That's what it says. So they're going to have a big problem here. And Mark Carney, I think, is going to have a big problem, because the MPs are going to be unhappy that their constituents are unhappy, and this probably took them a lot by surprise, as we know, not necessarily consulted on this stuff, and then they have to go and answer for it, right? These 20 MPs have to go back to their constituencies and answer for this MOU now. And it sounds like what they're trying to say to their constituents is, oh, listen, it's probably not going to happen. See, EB is there. But the constituents may not buy that. They may not be happy that MPs that they voted for on climate change and all of this stuff are kind of trying to apologize for Mark Carney for stabbing them in the back, right? They're probably not too happy that this guy isn't who we voted for. This is what Canadians across the country are starting to realize. So this opens up the opportunity for the NDP to go in and grab those types of people, because the Conservatives are not going to be grabbing people who are anti-pipeline, right? It's not going to happen. But this is where the NDP can step in. And if the NDP can steal voters by saying, listen, we're actually going to fight for this, and once we get party status back, we're going to be able to be a voice, and we're going to be able to be in committee, and yada, 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 yada. There you go. At least Pierre Poilievre, he's honest about what he says he's going to do. And he's very specific about what he says he's going to do. Mark Carney was vague, tried to scare everybody, and now is doing everything the opposite of what he said he was going to do. So it's very, very interesting how Tlaib tried to, skirt that line and say, well, it's theoretical and blah, 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 and all of this stuff, and it's fine. Well, no, it's not fine. And it gets worse for the Liberals, because later a Liberal minister, Eleanor Olszewski, came on to CBC, and she was talked to about this and challenged on the fact that she was saying kind of the opposite of what Tlaib Noormohamed was saying. Check this out.
Eleanor Olszewski is the minister responsible for Prairies Economic Development Canada. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice, Minister. Thank you so much for being here in a busy week. Appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it, David.
You can see Danielle Smith trying to celebrate and sell this deal to a skeptical, I would say, membership of the United Conservative Party. You see the frustration in British Columbia. It's led to the resignation of one of your cabinet colleagues. Is this deal worth it if a pipeline is theoretical?
Absolutely it is, and the memorandum of understanding that was agreed upon between Premier Smith and the Prime Minister really, as my colleague Tabla Noormohamed pointed out, sets out a framework, so a set of conditions that will enable other steps to be taken, and they're matters that were a source of irritation and frustration for people that want some certainty and some investment predictability. And so certainly from an economic perspective, I think that the agreement not only strengthens our economy and our sovereignty, really, but also leads to incredible opportunities for people that work in the oil sands and other related industries in the province of Alberta. It allows us to diversify our exports from the United States to other willing customers. And, David, I was actually in Calgary yesterday, and I had an opportunity to witness the signing of the agreement. And I also attended the Calgary Chamber of Commerce lunch. And honestly, the excitement in the room was palpable. And, as a minister who's actually from Alberta, I was actually really proud that the province and the federal government have been able to reach an agreement really when there's been such tensions for a substantial period of time.
But you help me reconcile your optimism and those ovations and the potential for this to boost productivity and GDP and open new markets with all of the cautions that don't overreact. It's only theoretical. There isn't a pipeline proponent just yet. It's just an MOU on a conversation. Both things cannot be true.
So all of the latter comments that you've just said are true. There isn't not in fact a proponent at this point in time, but the agreement does set forward a framework, like I say, that will put the conditions in place to allow all of that to happen. The other thing that the agreement does, and I think built into it, are provisions that address so many of the concerns that people have. They're already articulated, already spelled out in the agreement. And so just by way of example, one of the first clauses in the agreement talks about the fact that both of the parties are agreed on the necessity of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. So that's one of the first things that's spelled out in the document. Throughout the agreement, there's reference to Indigenous peoples, to the need to engage, with the need to consult, also the need to include them.
Okay, so in the first First answer she gives, she's like, this is great, and it's going to happen, blah, 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 and all this. And then David Cochrane says, but your colleague was just saying that this is all hypothetical, and it may not happen, and there needs to be caution on this. Well, yeah, that's all true, too. And remember, she's a cabinet minister. She has to toe the line, or else she's out of cabinet. This is probably one of her tests to stay in cabinet and retain that 50% increase in salary, right? So interesting that happens. Interesting that David Cochrane actually called her out and said, well, how do you have both of these things that are true at the same time? And then she goes on to say, well, you know, it has this stuff, and, you know, it's caused the need to actually consult with Indigenous peoples and all of this. But this is where Mark Carney and Danielle Smith completely diverge. Because if you recall, in a previous video, we showed Danielle Smith saying, oh, yeah, that's in there. But that's the federal government. That's their job. It's not our job to be talking to First Nations groups in British Columbia. Our job is to talk to First Nations group in Alberta. That's our job. That's the federal government's job to do that, because that's across provincial lines. Otherwise, we're interfering within another province. While Mark Carney's people are saying, well, you know, that's Danielle Smith's job to do. So no one can agree on whose job it is to actually do this. And they're already trying to say, well, when it doesn't work, it's their fault. That's what's going on here. So very interesting on that aspect. And then David Cochrane does something pretty savage. I was actually really surprised that he did this. He actually shows, and they film this Liberal minister, her reaction to the Alberta legislature cheering about Stephen Guilbeault resigning. Check it out.
I know this is about resetting the relationship with Alberta, resetting the relationship with the government of Alberta. Yes. But I want to play a clip in this monitor, if I can, Minister. This is a new partnership, and on the day of this new partnership, this is what happened in the Alberta legislature when news broke that Stephen Guilbeault resigned. Just have a listen to this.
This day is full of incredibly good news. We got rid of the emissions cap, Mr. Speaker. We have a new pipeline coming here to Alberta, and we just learned that Stephen Guilbeault has resigned from the federal cabinet. So good news all around, Mr. Speaker. Simply,
I just wonder what you make of that this is supposed to be a new partnership, and this is a cabinet minister in Danielle Smith's government celebrating the resignation on principle of the former environment minister.
Yeah, and you know, that's unfortunate. And certainly, as I mentioned to you, David, I was in Calgary yesterday and met with a number of the Alberta ministers, and they were very positive about this agreement, they're not flippant in any way. And there was a lot of excitement about the notion of working together and working to build a project that will result in incredible economic benefit for Alberta as well as for Canada. So honestly, you know, my own view is when I was there yesterday, that's exactly how I saw this as you know, an arrangement that will make that will be of substantial economic benefit. Mm-hmm. And you know, I didn't see, you know, there
was a lot happening yesterday. Yeah, I know you were traveling, but this is what is happening, right? It's an interesting glimpse into what the relationship still is, right?
Yeah, I don't think that reaction characterizes what you know most of the politicians, most of the UCP. MLAs and ministers are thinking at this time.
I don't know if you're reading the room well, Eleanor, because they absolutely would. And they absolutely should. This is an environment minister that ignored advice about Jasper, which allowed half of the town to be destroyed. You really don't think people are celebrating the fact that this guy is out of cabinet? You're not reading the room. So yeah, I kind of don't blame them, but it's also pretty savage for CBC to show that and to show her reaction. So, but it also shows CBC's bias on full display, because David Cochrane was almost setting this up as somber, like, oh well, look at these people, look at them, and look at how they're reacting. Like, you're not supposed to be on the side of the people that you're interviewing, David, unless you're going to state your bias on your website, like we do. It's always hilarious when people say, well, you guys are biased towards right wing. Duh. But we tell you that on the tin so you know what you're getting coming in. The difference is we try to also be objective. If Carney does something good, then, we'll say it's good. If somehow a pipeline does come out of this and it gets implemented, we're going to say, Carney didn't have to do that, but it's good for Alberta, it's good for Western Canada, and it's good for Canadian prosperity. The problem is the way this was done doesn't feel like that's the intent at all. But the way he did it, he thought he was being really clever. I don't think it's going to result in a very clever outcome, right? Because, again, David Eby, not happy about this. He's not going to okay this. And if he's not going to okay this, then what is Carney going to do? Because he's already said, well, we need buy-in from the provinces. So if now he says we need buy-in from the provinces and then he overrules BC using his constitutional authority to do that, what is that going to do to the BC Liberal caucus then? What is that going to do to the Liberal voters out there? What's going to happen in the next election when all of those voters say, you know what, maybe the Liberals aren't who we need them to be, and we join the NDP instead? Now you have, let's say, 15 new MPs out there that are with the NDP and 15 less MPs from the Liberal government. Now they have a problem.